Okay. Hello again. Bonjour, tout le monde. And welcome to another panel from Science Policy Series, and this time sponsored and organized by National Killam Program. CSPC is pleased to brought you this panel in partnership with National Killam Program. We had many hundreds people registered for this session, and we are quite excited to hearing from the panelists. But first, I want to acknowledge the land I'm talking to you from, downtown Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, who is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis people. Today's panel is titled Addressing Bias and Inequity in the Research Ecosystem. Bias and inequity within the research ecosystem influence trajectory of national and international research, as well as future generations of researchers and institutions. In order to achieve world-class research, systematic barriers that limit full participation of Canadian talent must be removed. So at CSPC, we are quite pleased to have this panel in partnership once again with National Killam Program, and which brings to you experts of the equity, diversity, and inclusions, and the leaders and researchers in this field. Without any further ado, I want to introduce the moderator of this session, Dr. Elizabeth Cannon, who is the President Emerita, University of Calgary, and co-chair of National Killam Program Advisory Board. Dr. Cannon has no introduction from me, by the way, but she has been the university president at the University of Calgary for several years and has led research at the forefront of global positioning system since 1984, commercialization technology to over 200 agencies worldwide. She has served on the National Advisory Board on Earth Sciences to the Canadian Minister of Natural Resources, as president of the U.S. Institute of Navigation, and as past director of Canada Foundation for Innovation. Dr. Cannon has also served as the chair of Universities Canada and co-chair of the Business Higher Education Roundtable, and as a member of the board of governors of Sidra Medicine in Qatar. Dr. Elizabeth Cannon is the co-chair, as I mentioned, of the National Killam Program Advisory Board. The virtual floor is yours, Dr. Cannon, and pleased to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Merdad. It's fantastic to be with so many people, high level of interest in this topic. And we have a fantastic panel to, I think, really tackle some of the practical aspects around EDI and its impact on our research ecosystem. Because of the high level of enrollment, we're using the webinar format, which means that the audience is not visible. We will be taking Q&A. I'm sure now everyone is used to using the Q&A box to be able to enter questions or to be able to upvote questions. So rather than repeating a question, feel free to upvote it. It goes to the top of the list, and it'll be sure to be asked. We also have the chat line that is used for comments, for discussion. So feel free again to use that. We're going to have two polling questions during the session, one on demographics and one at the very end for feedback. So again, I hope you enjoy the session. I've certainly been really excited to be part of this. So just to provide some background before we introduce our panelists and get into the discussion, how did this come about? And really over the last few years, and I've been so pleased to be part of this, the administration of the National Killam Program transitioned from the Canadian Council of the Arts to the National Research Council of Canada, the NRC. And as part of that transition, the NRC was tasked with redeveloping the fellowship program of the program. And as many know, it is a fantastically strong program. It's a very important program on the research landscape. So consultations were done with hundreds of stakeholders in the research ecosystem. And what that led to is the development of the Dorothy Killam Fellowships, formerly known as the Killam Research Fellowships. And this was a very important change, bringing the name of Dorothy Killam into the fellowship program, because it is now centered on Dorothy Killam's vision, aligning with her goal of increasing the scientific and scholastic attainment of Canadians. So the National Killam program is now underpinned with key equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI, considerations, and again, honoring all of the values set out by Dorothy Killam. We know, and I don't have to explain to everyone here today, that racial and ethnic diversity has positive aspects on all aspects of our society, but within the bias and inequity within the research ecosystem influences the trajectory of national and international research, as well as the future generations of researchers and institutions. And in order to achieve world-class research, systemic barriers that limit full participation of Canadian talent must be both recognized and removed. So in this panel, we have equity, diversity, and inclusion leaders to discuss concrete, and I stress concrete actions that they are taking to overcome bias and to advance equity in decision-making. So based on their own professional and personal experiences, panelists will share insights on approaches to create a more equitable research ecosystem. So I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly. They all are very distinguished in their work and achievements. And then we'll get into some of the prepared Q&A and then allow time for the Q&A from the audience. So I'm going to start in alphabetical order with Dr. Mady-Ann Andrade, who is a professor in biological sciences at the University of Toronto. Her research uncovers links between mating behavior, ecology and evolution in variable environments, and she's an internationally recognized expert on black widow spiders. In addition, she's co-founder and president of the Canadian Black Scientists Network, co-chair of the Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence, and chair of the National Killam Selection Committee, which is the committee that actually put the work of the advisory board, which I co-chair, into action and did a fabulous job. Next, we have Dr. Kevin Hewitt, Associate Dean of Science, Equity, and Inclusion in the Faculty of Science at Dalhousie University. He is a professor in the Department of Physics and Atmospheric Science and former chair of Senate at Dalhousie. His work is in developing novel nanoparticle probes for cancer imaging and treatment, new optical imaging approaches, and a prototype medical diagnostic tool. And he is a colleague of mine as a member of the National Killam Program Advisory Board. Third, we have Dr. Carly Kehoe, who is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Atlantic Canada Communities at St. Mary's University. Her work concentrates on religious minority migration in the North Atlantic world. She's past president of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars and a founder and lead of the RSC's At-Risk and Displaced Academics and Artists program. And last but not least, a colleague from Alberta, Dr. Temitope Oriola. He's a professor and associate dean undergraduate in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. His work is known for field-defining sociological research on terrorism and policing, leadership and service to the discipline, and committing to mobilizing knowledge in support of informed public debate. In Canada, Temitope's scholarship is focused on policing, and his work on protest and policing against Black and other minority groups has earned him a well-deserved reputation as a leading expert on police reform. So you can see we have a terrific panel with us. And as I move into the moderated discussions, again, just to reinforce that research, this is not uninformed, it's informed research that shows inclusivity results in excellent research outcomes. Increased racial and ethnic diversity in the research has positive effects on all aspects of society. But inconsistencies do exist. Slower career advancement, blunted salaries, unequal workloads, work-life conflict, systemic gender biases, underrepresented representation in positions of power, hostile work environments. These are some of the issues that still remain to be able to overcome really true equality and equity across the system. So I won't go into all the research. Some of you are aware, and I'm sure it'll be touched on as well today. But let's focus and get right to some of the key issues that have been on our mind. And I'm going to turn to the first question. And what we will do is ask one of our panelists to give a 2 to 3 minute kind of overview on the question, and then we'll open it up to Q&A across the panel. So I'm going to start with you, Kevin, and ask how you would describe inclusive excellence. That's a term that's emerged over the last number of years. And what are its principles? So over to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It's my pleasure to be on this panel with such distinguished co-panelists. So when I think about inclusive excellence, I see that as two sides of the same coin, both in the research environment and the team. We need to incorporate inclusivity for many reasons, but number one, inclusive teams tend to make better decisions. The outcomes are better. Elizabeth just mentioned that, but as part of that those conversations become a little more difficult. There's a great example of a murder mystery that's set up between two teams, a team that's, rather homogeneous and teams that are more diverse. The teams that are more homogeneous tend to come to an answer more quickly and feel much better about the outcome than the more diverse teams who may take a bit longer to come to an answer to the murder mystery question and view their answer more skeptically. But in the end, it's the diverse team that actually comes closer to the answer. So how could this have benefited us if we look back? Could we have, unified the physics of the large scale and the small scale, right? Gravity and quantum mechanics. Could we have, to date, a theory of high temperature superconductivity? I think the lack of participation of many groups in science community has really attenuated or limited our ability to make progress. And we can also see the negative impact of the lack of inclusivity. Many indigenous communities around the world view the environment as part and parcel of them. Were this view to have held sway early on, would we be in the predicament we are today with respect to climate change? I say no. So the research team, as many studies have shown, could have answered these questions where we have started on this journey much earlier. So what interferes with our ability to get to that diverse team? Well, Elizabeth mentioned bias. That bias, of course, is part and parcel of our immersion in with the media, and even individual like myself who has been working in areas to advance Blacks in STEM. When I took the Harvard Implicit Association test, I too had bias for white. So we all have these biases, and in my view, speaking to really actions that we can take to address this, we need to use targeted approach to our hiring processes, because it's very difficult and next to impossible, even through training, to overcome these biases. So that's an approach that's used by the Canada Research Chairs programs to have targets among our equity deserving group members. Many institutions across the country are conducting inclusive excellence cluster hires in order to short circuit the bias. Once we've used those tools to get to a diverse community, then we can think about, rolling back some of those. And, just wrapping up, if the research is not inclusive, it will not be excellent. Many examples, but one in my particular area is the notion of a therapeutic window in optics that does not necessarily take into account the melanin content of the majority of people in the world. So we need to pay attention to it in our research in order to get better outcomes. So I will say, in the end, that were we to have started this process a lot earlier, some of the problems that we are facing today would have been solved many years ago. And I'll leave you with this thought. We stole scientists, astronomers from Africa and enslaved them. We stole scientists, astronomers, from Africa. Were they to have been involved in, in research to address some of these issues, we would be much further ahead.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Appreciate your thoughts. And what I particularly resonated with me of what you said was, I think the debate of, inclusive excellence, can it be achieved? Does one compromise the other? You framed it that if it is not inclusive, it is therefore not excellent. And I think we've kind of got to move to that place of, yes, that is where we need to be. I'm going to turn to Madiane and sort of build on what Kevin said. How does inclusive excellence inform your work, Madiane, and also the organizations that you are associated with? You wear many hats.
I do. Thank you very much for those comments, Kevin. So there's a lot of different ways to think about this, but one of the things I keep bringing people back to is that if we agree that innovation and excellence and the potential for novelty and impact lives in every population group, how do we account for the fact that when we look at a recent study in the United States, for example, that 80% of the professors at degree granting institutions in the United States come from 20% of the institutions that give PhDs? This means that there's a huge number and proportion of individuals coming out of other traditions, other areas, who are not being part of this machine we have that is meant to generate novelty for our societies. And so there is a way in which inclusive excellence means that we need to think about how to capture, in a selfish way, the talents that are available to us. And so that's how we think about it. Certainly that's how we're thinking about it in the Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence, where we engage in peer-to-peer education to try to make those things transparent to our colleagues. And so, for example, when we cite that study, some people will actually say, well, of course, we're hiring the people from Stanford and MIT and University of Toronto. That's what we want. And I'll say, if you have people with the same records, some of whom had the benefit of Harvard and Stanford and MIT, and some of whom come from university you've never heard of before, but have an equal number of high impact publications, who do you think actually had to work harder, overcome more, and in effect, be more impactful in order to get where they are now on your short list? And that gives them pause. And so I guess that's what we're trying to do, give people pause to think about what we're actually looking for, which is novelty, impact, and great ideas that we selfishly can leverage. And so that's what we try to illuminate for people and have them start to think and talk about.
Great. I'm now going to turn to you, Carly, sort of final response to this question. And that's really from your perspective and dealing sort of within the new college and the RSC. How has inclusive excellence really been sort of operationalized within the various aspects of your personal work, but also in the organizations that you've been involved with?
Yeah, so thank you very much for that. And the points that Kevin and Mei-Dian just made are really, really important. I come from very rural Cape Breton, where there was almost no communication with universities. So it's really intimidating to walk into this world with nobody who's gone before you. And we need to make it easier. And like Mei-Dian just said, we also have to recognize that excellence does not just come from a handful of universities. I had the benefit earlier in my career of being a part of an organization called the Global Young Academy, which brought in kind of early and mid-career scholars from around the world. And I think it represents 80 or 86 countries now. And it was an important mix of Global North and Global South representatives that helped me to understand the imbalance in how research is appreciated and understood. So when I became a member of the RSC's college, I had that at the back of my mind, and I was able to identify where I was uncomfortable with some of the problems. But what has been really wonderful at the college level is that there has been a real support for inclusive excellence to the point that it is now in our strategic plan. And it wasn't before. And so it's a guiding principle for the college. It's built into who we are and how we want to go forward. And we have a lot of work to do, please don't get me wrong, but at least we are recognizing it, and we're hoping that that transfers to the fellowship. But it's been, we've had a lot of support for that. We haven't had significant pushback, and I think people have recognized the need to move in this direction because we have a responsibility to use our research for the public good. And it doesn't do any good if it excludes the public.
Thank you very much, Carly. And I like what you said around building inclusive excellence into your strategy, because having been a former university president, words matter. And once it's in strategy, then it gives a mandate and an ability to hold ourselves accountable. And that's really, I think, when things get done and change happens. So let's move on to our second question, and Temitope is going to lead us off. And it's really from what is inclusive excellence to how do we create an inclusive research environment. So Temitope, I'm going to turn it over to you to speak to that.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm delighted to join you all. First of all, an inclusive research environment can be created through the sum of several seemingly small things. A lot of these issues look small, but they're coming together of those items create an inclusive research environment. So first, the unit or university overall climate. It's important to work towards an environment where people feel connected and feel free to be themselves. And of course, that entails keeping toxic relations at a minimum, if not entirely eliminated. Second, I believe it's important to have a robust constellation of mentoring opportunities. This would include things like mentoring opportunities for top undergrad students to work as research assistants, and of course, possibly spark their interest in pursuing grad education, and of course, to have individuals who would guide them through the process. And as part of that second point, there's also the need for opportunities for grad students to receive mentoring from their supervisors and committee members over and above their thesis research in and of itself. This would entail serving as more than data collectors, but collaborating in terms of presentations and co-authorship and so on and so forth. The third part of that second point entails having junior faculties receive mentoring as regards things like proposal writing, feedback on papers for publication, and of course, information about opportunities that are available within and outside academia. Now, in particular, new hires from minority groups often face an extra layer of isolation and alienation. And I like to underscore extra layer. And of course, pervasive indifference around them regarding the success of their careers. And I believe it's important that each department or unit assign specific mentors for new hires to help them, at least for the first couple of years following their being hired. This could also include mentoring through the tenure and promotion process. I believe unit or department chairs have a major role to play in this regard. My third broad point concerns having clear guidelines and processes for basic bureaucratic decisions. So have a process for career-defining decisions like award nominations and matching funds. And now, to my knowledge, most universities have clear guidelines for award education. However, nominations from eligible units tend to be quite whimsical. One individual, for example, became aware of their department's nomination process when they became chair of the department. And that was slightly over 20 years after being hired. That meant that that individual never did get nominated for anything in those 20 plus years. And essentially the process that was in place was that interested faculty members basically emailed the chair to say they were interested in so and so award, or requested to have lunch or coffee. And this was how award nominations were done for decades. Now, I emphasize award nominations because we are in an academic culture in which, quite frankly, the more you get, the more you get. Therefore, who is nominated for or receives what is essential for an inclusive research environment. It can be the difference between a swift takeoff of an individual's career and a prolonged delay. So I would suggest self-nominations where and if appropriate, especially for units that seem impervious to change. My fourth point concerns having a very strong culture and to really work hard to prevent biased selection and deselection in this crucial nomination process. And fifth, and just slightly controversial, my next point, I believe that it is important that university leaders at the central or decanal level ensure that accomplished scholars are appointed to positions of chair and other crucial portfolios. My untested hypothesis, to put it somewhat undiplomatically, is that below average scholars in certain positions tend to over-politicize things and therefore generate deep fragmentation and discontent in their unit as members question every decision they make, fairly or unfairly. My sixth point concerns having clear guidelines regarding promotion and tenure and to implement them consistently. And I like to underscore the word consistently. The guidelines have always been there. It's the consistent application of those guidelines that's always the issue. And it's important to proactively approach top performers with opportunities for early tenure and promotion and all of that. My final point concerns celebration of the successes of faculty members, again, consistently. That could be via email announcements, brief remarks, during faculty meetings, department gatherings, unit newsletters, department the website, and so on and so forth. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Excellent points, I think, very much from a practical point of view, and really key words around consistency. If there's a consistency in process, people start to trust they understand the process, they can participate in the process, they'll trust the process. And also in that transparency piece, so key as well. I also very much appreciated your comments about self-nomination, of doing things differently. And the National Killam Program, one of the things that was integrated in was being able to be nominated from outside of a university. It may be a professional or scientific association or society, so that some of the usual norms and perhaps with that barriers can be overcome. So Kevin, I'm going to turn to you. what does an inclusive research environment actually look like? And you may talk about personal experience or university experience or sector discipline experience.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. So for me, inclusive research environment spans K to 16. And when I say K to 16, I mean that the researcher and team are conducting outreach to the community to try and get that research, to help the public good, to inform the community, to get them excited about that research. And then when we get to the post-secondary environment, I think our students should be mentoring the students in high school. So their task is not simply, to be in the lab, but to also be in the community. I feel it's very important, our role as faculty members, and the fact that we hold tenure when we get there, that and academic freedom, those are all granted in aid of the public good. I think we've forgotten that third pillar within the research teaching, and we've thought about service as simply service, to committees at the institution, but it's service in aid of the public good. So let's think of a research environment as not just being within the walls of the academy, but they extend and permeate outside of it.
Thank you very much. And it's so important, not just to recognize and reward that and be able to track and report on that as well. Carly, I want to turn to you, again, given your work with the RSC and elsewhere, what does the next generation of scholars expect from an inclusive research environment?
Yeah, that's it.
Different than when I went through. What does it look like? What do they expect?
It's a really good question. It's also urgent because I am hearing of a lot of outstandingly talented people leaving the research world because it does not speak to them, it makes no space for them, and it ignores them. I spent the first part of my academic career in the UK. And when I moved back to Canada to take up the CRC, I was shocked at the hierarchical system here. It is not working to recognize excellence. It's actually working to recognize age. And that does not help us at all. And I think the next generation of scholars coming up, and we're all here now, seniority doesn't really work anymore. It's what are you going to bring to the table? Like what Tematope had stressed, it's really important that you recognize excellence and you put people who are capable and competent in leadership roles instead of waiting until other people think they've served their time, they've jumped through the hoops. I suppose we can do that because we're hemorrhaging people. We're hemorrhaging also the best people, because they're realizing that the opportunities outside of the research world or outside of the public research world are better and more exciting and also more responsive to change.
Thank you very much. You've opened up so many issues. Recognizing only 25% of people who get PhDs end up in a tenure track position. These are very important positions, very difficult to get. And then when you get people who do get them that are sort of disillusioned, that is obviously tragic on an individual basis, certainly on a societal basis, and also some of the issues around leadership. And we could have a whole other panel on leadership within the research and academic community. I'm very committed to that from my past life, and we don't do enough, I think, to reward it, to help shape it, and because that shapes our institutions. So to close off this question, I wanted to talk to you, Emma, and ask really about what institutions can do. We heard it from the researcher's perspective, but Medianne, what can institutions do to better support? Because again, we have to look at structural potential policy change within our institutions? Over to you, Madian.
Thanks for that question. To make these things structural, we really have to build them into our processes in meaningful ways. And that includes reimagining how we evaluate people for their talent as a mentor, as well as their own research output. I always say to people, one of the reasons the Tri-Council gives us credit, if you will, for the students who we train, right? They want to know about our mentorship practices. They want to know who we've graduated. They want to know if they've landed in jobs that are, commensurate with their training. One of the reasons I do that is we are not only contributing in terms of the impact of our own research, we're contributing in terms of creating the opportunity for the next generation of high impact researchers to flourish. And so the university needs to recognize that explicitly in the way in which they assess people each year for their progress, in the way in which they think about tenure decisions, and the way in which they think about promotion, which has been touched on earlier by my colleagues. But the ways in which we integrate that are important, and it has to sort of be at all levels. So there's those overarching policies about the big milestones in your career. But at a granular level, it means giving researchers, whether they're senior or junior, the tools and the impetus to actually make changes. So I know, for example, at U of T, they have a new thing called the Healthy Lab Initiative, which sounds like it's about air quality, but in fact, it's about considering the mental health and the career aspirations of your trainees in your plans for their mentorship. So are we actually listening to our trainees? Do individual researchers have their own statement of values for the research group that is available to everyone, and that so their students know what they expect and what is expected of them? So we in our group have something we call critique the research, support the researcher. So think about what that person's goals are, and then make sure you're supporting them in moving towards it. So basically building it at all levels.
Thank you very much. And you're really speaking to culture within the organization, which again is so critical. And sometimes I think we forget as academics and researchers, when we talk about doing these things, it's really us. It starts, again, I've been a university president. People think, well, it's your job to do all this. No, it needs to be collective. If there's not buy-in across the institution, that can make it difficult. So we all own a piece of this in terms of action and responsibility. Okay, let's move on to the next question. We're going to tee up Carly and start talking about solutions. So what are some of the proposed solutions to address the current barriers and gaps in research recognition and evaluations? Things like awards and prizes. Temitope had sort of mentioned that in his opening remarks in the last question, but what do you see as some of the solutions that we can bring to bear?
Thank you very much for that, Elizabeth. I gave a lot of thought to this question, and I have two parts and two examples that I'd like to use to highlight each part. The first starts with evaluation, and how people start to get evaluated depends a lot on what they have been recognized for in their research. I think that there are big problems with metrics, for example, because they're all skewed. Citations are skewed. I'm convener of the Scottish Historical Review Trust. I'm a historian. We started to realize when we looked, and we have to look at ourselves and be brave enough to say, my goodness, we've got a lot of problems here. So when we started to look at our processes for this particular journal, we started to realize that we had a real gender bias. We started to realize that our board had not had a balance ever. We started to realize that the articles that we were publishing had hardly any women referenced in the citations. And this is what was being used to teach the next generation of scholars. So when you're thinking about something like citations or metrics, it's obvious immediately women don't score as highly because they're very rarely referenced. That's just one small example. And in order to get recognition by being nominated for awards or winning awards, you have to demonstrate, you've had all this reach, you've made this impact, you're recognized. It's really hard to put yourself in the running for something when there's a lot of biases in the system and there's a lot pushing against you. So that's one example. In terms of awards and prizes, I want to talk about the Royal Society of Canada's College and what we have done, because this is practical and it's immediate, and people are kind of fed up with all the chat and they just want to implement change. So first is you need to know who you are, and you have to, like I mentioned before, be brave enough to understand that there are problems, there are structural problems. So how are you going to fix them? The first is you have to reform the selection boards. You have to say, we have to make sure that these boards are representative. And for us in the college, it was in terms of background, it was in terms of discipline, it was also in terms of region. There was significant like Atlantic Canada needed more representation. And so we have to be very aware of who is making the decisions about who gets in and who gets awards. That's a hard thing to do because not everybody wants to change. And it does take strong leadership to say, I don't care, we are moving an agenda forward because it is in the public good and it is best for us in the long run. There's also a really important need to then review your selection processes to see where they might be disadvantaging people. Last year was the first year, for example, that the college sent out an EDI questionnaire. We didn't know who our pool was, so we didn't know who we weren't reaching. And when we got the results, it was really clear that we were not appealing to a lot of groups. And so we realized we need to do more to reach out and demonstrate what we can offer to other groups. We also need to establish pathways to make space available at the table. Who is being missed? What voices are being missed? When you're talking about an organization like the Royal Society of Canada's College, you're talking about research leaders. But it's not really research leaders if an enormous proportion of the researchers aren't even applying because they don't feel that they have a space there. That's absolutely essential. One of the things that we did in addition to working to revamp our selection processes and embed inclusive excellence in that, was also to establish a program called ARDA. And Elizabeth, you mentioned this at the beginning, and ARDA stands for the At-Risk and Displaced Academics and Artists Program. These are colleagues just like you and I who are displaced to Canada because there has been war or conflict or threats of violence in their home countries. There are actually a lot of highly skilled academics and researchers who are displaced to Canada. And I knew that because I'd set up programs like this before, I knew that often they would never be nominated by their host universities. And so what we did was we established a 3-part program. The first aspect is membership. And it is direct application. To get into the Royal Society of Canada's College, you have to be nominated. Except in this stream, because we knew that these colleagues don't have the network, they don't have, the universities aren't always aware that they're there. And so these colleagues can now speak for themselves, they can apply directly, and they can tell us what they have done in their research lives. The other element is mentorship. So everybody that applies to our program is offered a mentor in the college or fellowship to help them understand what they might need to know to survive in Canadian academia. None of these colleagues get told this information when they arrive. And for the first year, at least, they're just trying to get through what they left. And it's a real problem. But mentorship it's professional advice, but sometimes it's just a friend who they can talk to. And the other element of this program is a workshop. And this workshop is basically a crash course delivered by faculty members in the college to these researcher faculty members who are displaced, again, to give them the nuts and bolts of Canadian academia, what getting a job looks like, what an interview process looks like, what the CV is supposed to look like, because our program has to go beyond kind of the top level. It has to be all inclusive and supportive across the board. You can't just say, I'm going to make space and then leave it at that, because it's still going to alienate people. But these processes that we implemented with the college, I must say we had unanimous support from the RSC Council. I think sometimes it just takes having an idea and being prepared to work really hard and get people behind you and with you to help push something forward. I don't tend to take no for an answer, and it's been helpful.
And it should be encouraged. Nadine, I want to turn to you. You're just coming off chairing the National Killam Selection Committee. Did a fabulous job. Could you speak to, 2, 3 best practices, things that were implemented in that process that you think were particularly helpful to ensure a process that you could stand behind and said, yes, it's fair, it's equitable, we got to the right place by making the right considerations?
Yes, definitely. So the whole piece of that role was figuring out how to go from the guidelines and policy, which gave a lot of tools for saying, here's where we want to go, to figuring out how to ensure that principles of inclusive excellence were respected throughout the process, but also that the committee itself, which was a committee of outstanding scholars who definitely wanted to make good choices, that they had the tools they needed and the confidence in a defined process that was transparent so that they could actually make those decisions in a good way. And I'll just say, to me, the 2 key pieces to that is that we need to have 2 levels of oversight, and they have to be connected. So one level is the overarching group that collects the information, that administers the process, that has information on the demographics of the appointees and the nominations and the applicants, say. And that group also has a intimate understanding of the policy and the guidelines that have been set in whatever process you're looking at. So that is critical. And they are at arm's length from the on-the-ground process, which is being enacted by a committee, right? So this is what we see at institutions everywhere, and what Carly was just referring to in the Royal Society. You have a group that's actually making the decisions. The second level that I find is often missing is that there has to be at least one individual inside the on-the-ground process who is intimately aware of the data on how these processes are susceptible to bias. And that person needs to be connected to the broader level group without themselves having information about any of the private data that have been collected on the applicants. In my opinion, that person also has to be non-voting. And the reason for that is that as they are helping to guide the process within the selection committee, it has to be very, very clear that they have no stake in the decision that is ultimately made. They are providing information and flagging when things that are clearly concerns about bias come up in the process. So just to give you an example, for example, that on-the-ground person would start out by making sure that it's clear how the guidelines work, how demographic information is going to be considered. They're also going to be the person who can say that they feel like the process is slipping into old cultural norms rather than a newly defined guidelines. So for example, elite institution bias. If the conversations are moving towards that kind of a focus, this person who's non-voting says, those are good points, but I'll just remind you that the guidelines say this, and in fact, we are looking for excellence in the record, not in the trajectory or the golden trajectory they have. So that's just one example. The second is that the connection between these 2 levels means the person on the inside can help to course correct if the decision-making looks like it's moving far away from expectations from an equitable process. So the overarching body has the demographics of the pool. When the first step comes of the long list, the non-voting assessor will provide the data on what that long list looks like, and then will be provided with anonymized data on whether certain groups are missing. If groups are missing, a key principle of this, in my opinion, inclusive excellence adjudication, is that you think about elevating some records to consideration. No one is ever demoted out of the pool that's considered to be excellent, but you have a swath of applications where, as we all know, it's apples and oranges, right? These are all excellent. Who's going to end up on the short list or the long list? Then you get down to arguing small items, and that is actually in the literature. Those decisions are not based on quantitative or anything quantitative that we can put our finger on. They're based on idiosyncratic decisions of the committee. So we move away from that. So those are the things. 2 levels of oversight: connection, the principle of elevating rather than demoting, and then connecting it to data while maintaining privacy.
Thank you very much. And it was a fabulous process. And I think really, as you say, it's these real-time checks and balances, as opposed to getting to the end and say, oh, how did we get here? You're monitoring all the time. Temitope, I wanted to move to you in terms of solutions to implement to address barriers and gaps in research recognition. I think, this was touched on a few times in our discussion. People are doing different kinds of research. It may be community engaged, it may be in the lab, what have you, but how do we address some of these gaps in actually recognizing research and research impact?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as Associate Dean, I sit on a bunch of committees. And as I referenced in my preliminary remarks, there have always been issues around nominations from eligible units. So part of what I've tried to do is to work with the chairs of eligible units to send us a robust list of potential nominees. And because part of what we found was that if there were 14 or 15 awards at stake, they might stand 2 or 3 nominations, so 2 or 3 categories. And yes, they're only required to send 1 name per category, but there were other, 12 or more categories that they might not bother to send names for. So we tried to work with them to ensure that they were sending nominees for those other awards. I also try to ensure fair and objective adjudication. And part of how I do that is to, within a very collegial atmosphere, ensure that there's no ranking discrepancy. So for example, say on a committee of 5 plus the chair, 4 of the committee members have ranked the certain candidate first or second, and there's the 1 committee member who ranks the same candidate 10th. We will ask them very nicely and respectfully to please explain why that is so. And I find that, again, how a thing is said is as important as what is said, that they would oftentimes concede that perhaps they were wrong in how they looked at a particular file or nominee, and would agree that, agree with the other committee members and so forth. So we would often try to build consensus rather than sort of an acrimonious or contentious atmosphere. And when I took up my role, one of my main tasks was essentially to help co-produce setting guidelines, so revising guidelines for adjudicators, and to help them directly confront bias in the process. And we would have preliminary meetings to discuss those issues and how we would deal with them and all of that, in order to ensure that we were considering the wide breadth of talents and efforts at our faculty. And I'm very clear from the onset that our decisions would need to be in concert with the EDI policy of the university. So for example, we would prioritize first-time winners, regardless of their background. Because one of the things you might notice in academia is a concentration of certain recognitions in a few hands. So I would ask for the historical winners and lists. Who won what and when, and all of that, and see, so how many women in the last 5 years, how many people from ethno-racially marginalized backgrounds historically, and all of that. And in situations of ties, of the guidelines would have been, abundantly clear that if someone who's won a particular, say, teaching award 3 times ties with someone who's never won the award, that regardless of that person's background, the first-time person wins. So again, when you frame it that way, I believe that colleagues do buy into it, and when you would experience very little to no resistance, because again, you're making a case for recognition of the broad talents and efforts of colleagues. I mentioned self-nominations earlier. I cannot overstress that. I think that's absolutely crucial. And thank you, Carly, for the work you're doing at RSC and the processes that you've put in place there. The other thing I think is crucial is considering the appropriate number of format of reference letters. 2 reference letters as against 3 or even 1, and why do we need them? And there's a whole host of academic engagement on who's able to get letters like that and from whom and all of that. So I think these are things that we should be proactively addressing. Why do we need 3 letters of reference, for example? Because for a lot of folks from minority backgrounds, they're drawing from a relatively small pool of mentors. And those mentors, by the way, could be from any background, but it's important that we're very intentional in terms of what we're requiring. And of course, guidelines to prioritize underrepresented groups. I mentioned that earlier. I think that's crucial, especially in awards that have historically not been equitably distributed despite top performances across the board. There's also the question of detailing specific research areas that are likely to increase nomination of minority group members. And so, for example, a review of my department years ago found that if we had an area such as globalization, that we would have a much more diverse department. And that began to be examined by the department vis-a-vis how we increase the diversity of the department. And the last point I'll make concerns ethno-racial diversity on adjudication committee. I think Carly and my colleague, Dr. Andre, have put that much more articulately than I ever could. But that cannot be overemphasized. Now, people come at these issues from different perspectives. We're all products of different kinds of backgrounds. And I recall when I served as the special advisor to the government of Alberta on the Police Act review, we met with a broad range of stakeholders, including rural Albertans and Black Lives Matter activists. Rural Albertans wanted more police in their communities. BLM activists and people from the Black community felt over-policed and underserved. And therefore, my recommendations had to grapple with the empirical realities that were equally valid, confronting these 2 communities. And therefore, we had to almost take like a middle range approach in terms of customizing what it was that each of those communities needed in order to have a safe policing environment where the police and communities got along very well. So I think that's in a way applicable as well to academia.
Thank you very much. I think your remarks, Temitope, lead wonderfully on to the last question, which Madiane is going to lead off. And that's what practical actions can be taken to create greater inclusivity in how research excellence is measured. How is it actually measured? So over to you, Madiane.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Sadly, it all takes more work. So I'm just going to say that up front. Impact factors are easy. Impact factors are not good reflections for reasons that have already been outlined by my colleagues, Carly in particular. The ways in which we measure research right now tend to focus on relatively few metrics that are field specific in terms of their ability to give you any signal at all of the person's sort of impact or novelty. So one piece is holistic assessment of people's records. I think there's many guidelines that talk about that. But we never really train faculty on what that means. And we don't necessarily have this format that I talked about where within a committee, you have at least one person who understands what that means. At least one person who recognizes, you know what, this letter of reference is riddled with doubt raisers and with gendered or racialized language. We need to set it aside and ask for a new one. These kinds of things where we actually take the literature and what the literature is clearly telling us and use it in our practices. What I hear over and over again from people is they're sitting on a committee and they hear something and they think, oh, I think that's really wrong. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to address it. And the chair doesn't address it because maybe they're in the same situation. I think things are going awry, but I don't know how. We need to have much more granular education for faculty. And I'm a little bit biased here. That's the whole goal of TIDE, the Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence. We actually give people phrases. And to Temitope's point, ways to do it in a collegial manner that aren't calling people out. All of our processes need to start at the beginning with here's our goal, here's our strategic initiatives that are driven at the level of the institution. Here's why legally we have an obligation to do this. This is not about sort of ideology. This is not about politics. This is not about your personal thing. This is not about what's in your heart or mind. I don't care what's in your heart or mind. These are professional behaviors that result in good decision making. And so I think we need to be much more explicit about all of that. It needs to be explicit at the level of the institution. We need to make sure that our chairs, to the points earlier about leadership, we need to make sure that one of the essential competencies for our leaders is understanding how to implement these things. And that doesn't mean that we kick everyone out who is currently would have to learn this. It means we give them the means to learn it in our institutions, and we provide some impetus for that. So again, I would say the key thing is not just know the literature, but be willing and able to discuss how it's actually manifesting in day-to-day processes.
Thank you very much, Madianne. So important. And, it's fascinating, that we're talking about this, that, processes, discussions, decisions should be research informed in a research environment. Who would have thought that? But it's so true. And, I think some of this comes down to human nature. Most people inherently don't like conflict, and putting some of these issues on the table can be personally potentially uncomfortable for people. It could generate conflict too. So to Tenetope's remarks of equipping people with the tools to do this in a respectful, research-informed way, that's what's going to elevate the whole process. Some of this obviously depends on, what we call self-identification data. And we have seen barriers just trying to overcome people participating in providing self-identification data. Kevin, over to you. What barriers need to be overcome to have a stronger participation so people feel comfortable coming forward and self-identifying?
So I wanted to say that when we first launched the Dalhousie census, one of the things we thought would be really helpful is for equity deserving group members to they produced a video describing, what are the benefits to you as an individual identifying, right? How it can lead to, more programs that targeted certain groups. So that sort of education is really key. I wanted to go back a bit though. To what we were discussing. I really, in my role as Associate Dean Equity and Inclusion, I'm building a group of what's called employment equity facilitators. This comes from, some great work done at McMaster University. And these individuals are comprehensively trained. And so I'm putting in place a series of workshops, etc., including TIDE, to train these individuals to address what Madianne has mentioned earlier. So that comprehensive training leads them to be able to manage at the committee table, and not only on searches for new hires, but also they'd have the expertise to serve on awards committees. So that's really something that I think will make a huge difference. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. And final question to you, Carly, before we open it up to the questions from our audience. Really, is there anything you wanted to add in terms of the measurement of research excellence from an inclusive perspective? What other things are you seeing to ensure that research excellence is more inclusive with respect to how we measure it?
Yeah, thanks for this, because after this, people were talking, there was something that popped up into my mind, and it is this recognition of what people have contributed. And two things. Those of us who are involved with leading award groups or trusts that give awards can actually just say, we're not prepared to continue to fund this unless it is representative of excellence. Another thing, this was, and it goes to Madian's point about there's so much hard work and you often feel discouraged. And sometimes you don't know how things aren't changing. But the Donner Prize, for example, this year is a pretty stark example of what's going wrong, in my opinion, where all 5 of the finalists are male. They're all in Ontario and 4 out of 5 are in Toronto. How on earth is that inclusive excellence? And how on earth is the board not recognizing this? So calling it out in forums like this might be the only way to say we need to move to a more inclusive and excellence framework.
Thank you very much, Carly. I think an excellent way to round out our discussion. The CSPC is going to put up their first poll for about a minute, I believe, to get some demographic data if you want to fill that out. But while that's happening, we're also going to move to some of the questions that have been provided during our discussion. And I think the first one that had the most votes is very interesting and a natural extension of some of the things we've been talking about. So I'll put that on the table, and it's hoping you can equip us with advice in engaging with our institutions when coworkers or management show reluctance in acknowledging their bias, especially when it's impacting work. Who wants to tackle that one? I'm going to look to you, Temitope, to lead us off here.
Well, that's a tough one, and this doesn't get recorded. Well, it is very tough, and I'll cite an example regarding how Black faculty members at the University of Alberta got together in 2020 in the wake of the assassination of George Floyd, and began to advocate. We did a quick, relatively not so scientific head count of tenured and tenure track Black profs at the U of A, and we found that there were approximately 17 to 21 individuals who were Black and tenured or tenure track at the U of A out of 2,058 individuals, or if you like numbers, 0.8% or so of full-time faculty members. Now, we have different options in terms of how to proceed. And I happen to be one of those who believe more in having a seat at the table and having rational conversations rather than the placard kinds of folks. Just my own personal approach in terms of what I prefer. And we got ourselves organized and drafted letters and started engaging with deans and the university president, who was entirely new to the U of A at the time. And we had a series of meetings and all of that. Within, I would say, 8 to 9 months, which was a record speed, given the significant budget cuts that were going on at the U of A at the time. The U of A president wrote to us to mention that the university would be engaging in a Black excellence cohort hire. One of the individuals who midwifed that exercise is actually one part of the audience today. Yeah, so thank you, Evelyn, if you're listening. Now, but the approach was key. In terms of very respectful, very engaging, fair, and firm. So on the one hand, the university was grappling with major budget cuts. So our request had to be mindful of that reality that confronted university administration. And on the other hand, there were real issues in terms of representation. So for example, the Women's and Gender Studies Department, the bastion of intersectionality, had precisely one non-white faculty member who was hired as far back as 1998. And we thought that was not a reasonable state of affairs. So we did a department by department, faculty by faculty analysis and presented that analysis to the university administration. So I would say arm yourself with the facts, with the evidence, and then present those evidence of facts to the admin at whatever level, and express a willingness to meet to discuss those issues. That was the approach that we used. It was respectful, it was firm, it was reasonable, and it worked.
I think that's an excellent response. You're right. Having the data, showing up to be part of the solution, that's what's going to get you traction for sure. I'll move to the next question, which is how are research institutions assessing whether their efforts in EDI are succeeding and what kind of metrics are typically used? Kevin, do you want to jump into that one?
Sure. So Dalhousie, I think, has been collecting census data for quite a long time, and publicly sharing the data with bodies like the Senate and board is an important part of understanding where gaps exist in our professors, and therefore we can bring to bear the institutional participants, faculty members, to press the administration for changes. Prior to my term as Senate chair, I had never seen that data publicly at the institution. And so, upon starting the role as Senate chair, that's one of the first things we call for. And I think it made a big difference because at Senate, of course, you have the president of all the leadership there who are being called to account. So it's important that this be publicly available, and many institutions, are on board with that now, but it's really key.
Well, and I think it also speaks to the importance of self-identification, because if that's not there, it doesn't sit on a strong foundation. Would any of our other panelists like to jump in and add to Kevin's remarks on this topic? Go ahead, Media.
I just want to reinforce that some institutions now have active dashboards where you can look at the proportion representation. They're starting to tackle intersectionality, and they're also looking at the employment or the labor market gap insofar as we can actually look at it. In addition to that, we have data now. The Statistics Canada now has a disaggregated data action plan, which is another great way to look at it. But I'll just flag that this does not necessarily capture everything we wanted to capture. If there are good data on rates of promotion, for example, rates of tenuring, rates of departures, even if they've been enticed away by someone else, that gives you data. If there are signals of gender or race or intersectionality or disability in that, we need to know. We do know that there are some big gaps, even if you look at StatScan data on disability in the professoriate. I actually think that's an area that we've barely begun to touch. A lot of people are either not willing to divulge that information, and that tells us something, or there are big gaps or big drop-offs in representation. So the data are often there. Universities have to collect it. The question, as Kevin said, is whether it's public. And the last thing I'd say in trying to engender support from your institution, enlist students in this effort and be willing to say reputational risk. This is language that I learned very early on, because it is a reputational risk in the current day and age not to tackle these things. It will come out anyway, right?
Well, and if there's anything that's going to get the attention of a university president, it's reputational risk, because that's what your institution lives or dies by. And so that has direct meaning, no question about it. Carly, I'm going to turn to you for the, go ahead, Kevin, last remark.
So I wanted to add two things here on the student activism. I think, behind closed doors, I encourage that student activism, because then that puts some pressure so that internally, we can say, okay, this is a big issue, let's work on it. So we need both Martin and Malcolm in order to effect change. And what was the other piece? Sorry, I missed.
We can come back.
As Associate Dean Equity, I had identified many years ago that the Queen's University tool, Diversity Equity Assessment Planning tool, could be, really well utilized. It has a dashboard, but speaks to climate as well. And so that's something that we're putting in place at Dalhousie in order to track both the culture and climate. So I have no stake in it, but it's an excellent tool.
Well, and I always certainly felt as a former university leader, by measuring and communicating data, metrics, KPIs, you're holding yourself accountable, but you're also building that accountability across the whole institution, because it's not owned by one person, but you're putting it out there. And I think that shows a lot of sort of honesty, vulnerability on important issues, that it is key that you are being very transparent about how you're doing and where you need to go together. So Carly, you to the next question. What does inclusive excellence look like in terms of criteria for promotion and hiring processes? The question is like, yeah, we say these things, but how do we get down to brass tacks in terms of maybe a document or a framework? Is there anything that you've seen that you've been involved with that speaks to this, that can be helpful for others that are looking to implement?
Just one example is we know that women don't go for promotion when they should, and they wait until they're absolutely certain that there's no reason why they can get knocked back. And even when they're in the application process, they're nervous. They think they've done something wrong. And I think that supporting those colleagues to ask them to go for promotion. I went for promotion to full prof, not because it was my idea, but because somebody else told me that I should, because it was that, the lack of confidence. And so sometimes you need people to say, you have met the criteria that is in place for these steps in your career. There is absolutely no reason why you should not be going for promotion. We also need to pay really close attention to the care responsibilities that people have. And there is a massive imbalance for people who have children or they have elderly relatives. It's not that they are not productive. It is that they are being split in a million ways. And one of the questions that was in the box talked about how do you avoid burnout? And to that, I have no idea. I really don't, because there are so many directions we're all being pulled in. What I do feel is junior members of staff or faculty members, they tend to get quite a lot put on their plates. They don't get the support for research at the early stages of their career that they should get, so that they can build themselves up and be supported in that as really productive scholars. And like Temitope said, if there's somebody who's won an award 3 times, but there's somebody who's won it just once, like that's a massive accomplishment that will support promotion and tenure. And those things, it's qualitative as much as quantitative. And often it's just saying, yes, you're absolutely good enough to do this, on your way.
Great, thank you. Temitope, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll just say that I had the opposite experience to Carly's in terms of going up for promotion and all that. And I should say that I got to the rank of full professor within 10 years or so of completing my PhD, so it's relatively fast. But every step of the way, I had to raise my hand and step forward and fight against, I would say, relatively mild pushback, which is to say, I am confident that I merit this. I would like to go forward. And thankfully, the university has a robust process in place where even if a chair says no, you could still go. The dean essentially becomes your chair to all intents and purposes through that process. So I had to always say, look, I want to go up. So in 4 years of arriving at the U of A, after a year at UMass Boston, I went up for tenure and got it. And within 4 years of being confirmed associate and tenured, I went up to the rank of full prof. But again, with a relatively mild pushback. But part of that was I was fairly aware of the CVs of colleagues at every level. Now, I was by no means a connoisseur of the CVs of my colleagues, but I had a very clear sense of where folks were and who was getting what and at what stage in their career. So I was fairly confident to step forward. And I also served on committees that exposed me to a number of those things. So for example, I'm just completing a 3-year term as a member of the Faculty Evaluation Committee. So if there's a junior colleague who's listening to this, please, that's one committee you want to be on. It will open your eyes. You would see, everything, I think much of it within the system, and perhaps give you a lot of confidence in what you've done, and remove that fear from your mind. So I think serving on that committee was incredibly eye-opening for me, and it was clear from the first year on that committee that I could go up that year and get it, and I just needed to wait a little bit after becoming associate prof before going up. So I just wanted to say that. So there are contrasting experiences in terms of this. Mentoring through the ranks can be very, very different. Some have had to essentially plow through stones, but you must be determined not to merely survive, but thrive. And that much of that is in your hands, in part because, well, academia, unlike perhaps most other areas, we do have these guidelines, and they offer, in my opinion, fairly strong protections against being held back.
Well, I always used to give advice to new academics, as you say, figure out the rules of engagement, and understand that. Don't sort of look at that at the point that you're coming up for promotion and tenure, because it may be, I won't say too late, but it may be challenging. Kevin, I'll let you jump into this, and then we'll move on to the next question.
So really quickly, the availability of standards, published on the university website would avoid this sort of backroom mentorship of those who are in the majority. Secondly, University College London system has an excellent suite of standards and activities by rank that we're looking at now. And what's also important is the workload distribution. So that conversation that should be had between chair and the member, because among the 3 pillars of evaluation, each year, if you're devoting more time to one versus another, I've seen at Dal some faculties where that workload is described. And so as you're considering the tenure and promotion file, you build that into the evaluation process. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. The next, it's a question and a comment. And the question to you, Mady, and maybe you can sort of give us perhaps your view on this, is the Killam process that you spoke about so clearly articulated available for public review? This is one of the best examples I've heard about how to work with demographic data within the context of privacy and confidential concerns. So kudos to you for the work that you've done. And I know certainly around the advisory board, we talked about, because we're so excited about the work, how does that get out there? And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm sure perhaps your interest around how do we get this out there and make it, this is sort of the new norm of how it should be done. Do you have some thoughts around that?
Yeah, I do. And I want to start by just saying that the pieces that enabled this was the outstanding staff, that administrative level in the National Killam Program Office, some of whom are on this call. And I just thank you so much, because it was creative. We could not find any guidelines on how to do this while respecting privacy and the standards of excellence, and we figured it out together. So that was important. The other piece, like I said, is having these overarching guidelines is critical. So again, Elizabeth, to you and your other committee members, Kevin, those guidelines were critical. We do want to publish a paper on it, just because we have heard from many people now that, so I'll be honest, maybe because I've spent 10, 15 years in this literature, I thought people knew how to do it and just didn't bother. I really did. Because when we started working through it, it seemed clear to me what path we could take. It's clear to me now that that's not the case. So we are planning to publish it. And Natalie, that's a commitment from me. So hopefully before the end of the year. But I do think it would be the kind of thing that I'd be willing to give talks on. To me, implementation of knowledge translation and then implementation are one of the things that I'm focusing on now, because I think it's that implementation piece that we're missing everywhere.
Great. Well, look forward to that. And question, and I'm going to ask you, Temitope, because it perhaps maybe were related to social sciences. I'm not sure. We're moving towards adopting narrative-based approaches to assessment of researchers. What are your views on this? And are there some risks that you envision for new biases in the system?
I have to say that I am a bit torn on that. It's one that we're still grappling with. I happen to be president-elect of the Canadian Sociological Association. And prior to that, I was president of the Canadian Association of African Studies. So I have a level of experience in terms of associations and awards and so on. So not quite like Carly and Median and all of those plum massive, huge dollar awards. But so it's like I had designed this set of guidelines for CAS when I was president of CAS. And that was what we used for the book awards and all of that. But other CSA members of the committee felt that the numbers there, the stats, and so 40% for these, 30% for that needed to be removed. So it meant that the evaluation guidelines became qualitative in its entirety. Now, this enjoyed a consensual support on the committee, and I felt that as chair, I needed to go with what my colleagues wanted. But it did produce remarkable results because now as chair, I got to rank the candidates as well, but I did not submit my rankings. So only the rankings of the committee members were used. Now, mine was sort of kept in reserve if there had been a tie. And as I said, I always favor an approach that would generate consensus. But in the end, we did arrive at a ranking that was fairly consistent by a single member of the committee in my most recent evaluation process. Now, but I do think that perhaps there's a space for those numbers, those stats, where and how we introduce that, I think would vary from one award or recognition to another, from one grant, education process to another. I don't think we've struck that balance yet, but personally, I favor a mixed methodological approach to this thing. So, for example, how do you measure impact or public impact? For example, beyond impact factor of papers and so forth. What if this had been tremendously a public engaged scholar, someone who's tremendously public facing, doing media interviews and so on and so forth? How do you reward them for those kinds of activities? The numbers may not tell all of that story. So I think the middle is where you govern in this case. It is to have a delicately poised and balanced approach between qualitative and quantitative measures of people's CVs and their qualifications for specific things.
Thank you. Well, we're going to bring this to a close. We could continue this for, I know, an extended period of time, but we've come to the end of our panel. The CSPC is going to put up a poll to get some feedback, so I encourage you to fill that out. I want to thank the panelists, fabulous group as an individuals and as a group, wonderful. Some very important topics tackled today around inclusive excellence. If it's not inclusive, it's not excellent. I'm going to remember that one. And we all have a responsibility. The environments that we create, created from university climates, robust constellation of mentoring opportunities, self-nominations, clear and consistent processes, solutions to barriers in research recognition and evaluation, reform. I think we heard about that. How do we actually do this? And Madian, you spoke so elegantly about that, as well as you, Kaylee. Practical considerations. Again, consider a holistic assessment of researcher records. Move away from more traditional measures and metrics. And competency of our leaders and leadership capacity. I think universities could do a lot more. But overall, it's a reputational risk not to tackle these issues. Student activism, you need to unleash that in a good way to create the right pressures for change. and building accountability by measuring and being transparent. So again, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our audience. The National Killam Program values this conversation, looks forward to continuing to address bias and inequity in research recognition. I know this is a topic, I think, for the CSPC to continue because of the interest. So stay tuned for future events. I see some in the chat and look forward to engaging with you again on something that's so important for not just the research community, but for our country of Canada and beyond. So thank you very much. Thank you again to our panelists, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.